Dr. Michael Parenti, author, educator, and longtime social activist. His books can be found in Thunder Bay Public Libraries, including his latest book entitled The Sword and the Dollar, Imperialism, Revolution, and the Arms Race. Dr. Parenti makes his home in Washington, D.C. The following lecture was given by Dr. Michael Parenti at the Waverly Library on October 27, 1989.
I'd like to thank Cable 7 for having their diligent crew here today, and I'd also like to thank Cable 7 for helping us promote Disarmament Week. They were a big help to us. The community channel is quite an asset to Thunder Bay. About 18 months ago, Reverend Stan MacLeod passed away. A lot of people here would know Stan MacLeod and know how active he was for justice all his life. Before Stan died, he asked that donations be made in his name, if people so desired, and be sent to the disarmament movement in his memory, because he felt very strongly about this. And it's to a large degree because of donations that were sent from the Thunder Bay area and the Winnipeg area that we were able to bring Dr. Parenti here for Disarmament Week. As Bill mentioned, we do need your financial help. I almost feel like a TV evangelist when I say but our group our group operates on a very low budget, and we're not in this to have money. We just need a certain amount of money. We operate on about $3,000 a year, and we just need a certain amount to be able to continue, but we are in need now. All right. Might be a good idea. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, let's see, we have, there's got to be somebody on staff. Oh, we got rid of everybody. I think it's a fitting tribute to Stan MacLeod also that Dr. Parenti will speak at Wesley United on Sunday morning at 11 a.m., which was Stan MacLeod's last church, the last church that he was minister at. In 1984, I was browsing through the Brody Library and I came across a book called The Anti-Communist Impulse, which is about U.S. foreign policy. And I took it home and I thought, my God, this is one of the best books I've ever read, because it dispelled so many myths that were given in our society about the Soviet Union, about our own country, about our economic system. And I thought, I wonder if this guy Michael Parenti is still around. And it was about 2 years later that I discovered, yes, he's still around and still going very strong. And I have become quite an admirer of Dr. Parenti's writing and his activism. Michael Parenti received his PhD in political science from Yale University in 1962, and he has taught at several universities in the United States. During his time teaching at the University of Vermont in 1972, he was involved in the struggle against U.S. intervention in Vietnam, and he was also involved in trying to democratize the oppressive system of the university. Because of his efforts and the efforts of other university professors in the United States in similar circumstances, his job was taken from him, even though the administration had voted for tenure for Dr. Parenti and he was well respected by the students. So he has put his job on the line, and he's also put his body on the line during those years of the Vietnam War, and he has been beaten by police, and he is not afraid to be in the fray. One of the latest reviews of Dr. Parenti's last book, which came out just some months ago, The Sword and the Dollar, says that it is essential reading for anyone who wants to be demystified. That is, for anyone who wants to find out what is actually going on and find out not only what the United States is doing and what the other countries of the world are doing, the major powers, but also how our mass media does not really tell us very much. He's a prolific writer. He's the author of 7 books. His 8th book is well into the works now. I'll just close by saying that recently I read a quote by John Lennon, the late John Lennon, who said that the way we live is the strongest political statement that each of us makes. Our guest has tried to live to help others. Will you please welcome to Thunder Bay Dr. Michael Parenti.
Thank you for the very nice introduction, and it's really a pleasure to be here. I've discovered I don't have my glasses with me, so I may be doing a lot of ad-libbing on this lecture. Someone's gone to try to find them, but he hasn't returned. So what I wanted to talk about was something that should weigh on the mind of everybody in North America, and that's U.S. foreign policy. As a U.S. citizen, I am impressed by the extent to which my government seems compelled to be involved all around the world, intervening all around the world. And I ask myself, well, why is that? What's so urgent that we have to be everywhere, very urgently have to be there? The Swiss don't seem to feel that compulsion. The Swedes don't, and a bunch of other countries. And why we? I mean, what is it? And when we're involved in the world, and those of us in the peace movement who argue we shouldn't be, we're told, well, what do you want to be, isolationists? And we say, no, we don't want to be isolationists. We want to have nice relations. But the method of involvement, we don't go out there and send out cultural teams and ballet groups. So there's some of that, of course. But when we're involved in Central America, it's with helicopter gunships and death squads and bombers that blow up villages, and we're involved with military aid. Our Navy is in every sea. Our long-range bombers cover just about every ocean. We're involved in Canada, and it's not just with hockey. I mean, we couldn't match you in hockey anyway, but we have nuclear weapons here. And what's this all about? Why are we in Vietnam, Lebanon, Angola, Mozambique, Afghanistan, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and one could go on, and indirectly in just about every Latin American country, and just about every Asian and a good number of African countries. Not all the African countries, because some of the other involvements are carried on by the French and the British. Great. Any luck? Oh, that isn't what this lecture was about at all. Let me start all over, okay? No, the answer that's given for our involvement is number one, is that we're in these places to defend democracy. I agree with you. That's my reaction when I hear it. I go, are you kidding? Defend democracy. But when you look at really where the U.S. intervenes so decisively, it seems to be just the opposite. In fact, the U.S. government has overthrown any number of democracies since World War II. In Greece, the Papandreou, the first one, government was overthrown and the Greek generals came in. In Guatemala, Arbenz was overthrown and the U.S. went in. In Chile, Allende was overthrown. In Brazil, Goulart. In Indonesia, Sukarno. In Iran, Mossadegh was overthrown, and in his place was put a murderous, torturous regime, the Shah. And each one of these cases, democratic or populist nationalist governments. I mean, Mossadegh wasn't exactly a Democrat. He wasn't popularly elected, but he was a nationalist. He wanted to nationalize the oil. He wanted to do things for Iran and all that. In each one of these cases, these people were overthrown, and right-wing fascist governments were instituted, which then began to exterminate and kill large numbers of people. Not at random. They killed very particular groups. They killed peasant leaders and labor leaders and intellectuals and political opponents and people of this sort. So it isn't to defend democracy. In fact, the U.S. went in and overthrew at least 7 democracies during the 1970s in Latin America. But one thing all of these democratic leaders had in common, all these national leaders had in common, even though they were different countries with different languages, different cultures, different political histories and everything else, is they all were beginning to use the political system to restructure the economic system. And that was really their sin. The U.S. is supposedly we go in to stop oppression, to help people and save them from oppression. Again, that's not true, because it turns out we not only overthrow democracies, but we support right-wing governments. We give elaborate aid to these right-wing kinds of governments. Take the case of Arbenz, what he did in Guatemala. Arbenz was the first democratically elected president Guatemala ever had. And when he came in, he legalized all opposition parties. I mean, the opposition parties had been functioning, but he legalized them. He legalized the student political organizations, which had been highly political. He legalized all opposition newspapers. He legalized trade unions. He increased the minimum wage. He started public work programs. And then he started to take the unused land that belonged to United Fruit Company, which is a U.S. multinational corporation, and distributed to hungry, landless peasants. And it was then he was overthrown by a mercenary army that was trained and equipped by the CIA, which, by the way, the CIA admits to. I mean, President Eisenhower, a few years later, pointed that out as a wonderful success story. And it was argued that Arbenz was a communist, and this is why it was done. His sin, and Mossadegh's sin, and Allende's sin, as I was saying, is that they were using the political system to actually bring about a change in the gross national income, away from those who live off dividends and commissions and interest payments and rents, and more toward those who live on wages and salaries. And that redistribution of income, which in the case of Chile and Guatemala and other places was actually benefiting the economy, that growth of the public sector as expense to the private sector was what caused that intervention. That is, what these people were doing is they were creating a competing social order, one in which the land, the labor, the capital, and the technology of that particular country would be used for the collective betterment and well-being of its people rather than for the enrichment of a few multinational corporations. So rather than this country being used as a cow to be milked for the capital accumulation process, this particular country, whichever it might be, was being used for the good of its people. And that was the unacceptable sin. It said that Arbenz was a communist. Allende was a Marxist. Allende, in fact, was a Marxist. His government wasn't. It was a Popular Front, a coalition of various governments. But what is a communist? And what is a Marxist? I'm not going to defend these people who were overthrown by saying they really weren't communists. Because the implication is that if they were communists, it would be okay for the U.S. to go in and kill them and murder whole bunches of people and set up death squads and do what is being done in Guatemala to this very day. To this very day. Well, what is a communist? There's a struggle going on right now in El Salvador, a national liberation struggle. Of the 5 political groups, at least 2 of them would very readily admit that they are communists, would identify themselves as Marxist-Leninists. It's time we ask ourselves, what's a communist? I mean, what do communists do that's so bad? Well, they do the things I've just said. They go in and they take over the village and they redistribute the land and they bring in health programs and they start committees for the defense of the revolution. They put in literacy programs. They bring in clean drinking water. They do all these kinds of things. They begin to use the resources of that particular system for the benefit of the people, whether they're communists or revolutionaries or whatever else. And by the way, the fact that they're communists or not communists is immaterial. These ruling elites, you think they're going to give up their power, their wealth, their land, everything that belongs to them if some group comes along and shows it's not communist? Oh, you're not communist? Well, then that's okay. I'm just worried that you're communist. By definition, you are a communist if you are now helping the people rather than helping yourself. And the argument that's always made is that these communists are just out there hungering for power. Rather than wanting the power to end hunger, they merely hunger for power. And if communists were just interested in hungering for power, why do they side with the powerless? Why are they out there on the picket lines standing in the rain? Why do they risk their lives? Why do they risk their careers fighting for social justice if in fact all they really are is a pernicious group that for some reason wants power? Why do they take such a roundabout, circuitous route to power? Why don't they do what all power seekers do? Suck up to power, serve power, please power. Why don't they take the Henry Kissinger road to power? We've got those kind of people who hunger for power. You could see it oozes out of their pores. Like Professor Kissinger. They look east to get appointed to Dartmouth, to get appointed to Harvard, Princeton, or Yale. And when they get to Harvard or Princeton and Yale, they look south to get to Washington, D.C. And when they get to Washington, D.C., they're there as a presidential advisor, and they're writing the kinds of things. Henry Kissinger got where he was because he wrote the kind of books that Nelson Rockefeller liked. And when Kissinger became Richard Nixon's Secretary of State, Nelson Rockefeller gave him $50,000 as a going-away present. Said, "Here, Henry, you just remember whose boy you are. Just remember who brought you out of that Harvard Research Institute and made you what you are. You're working for Tricky Dick now, but you belong to me." That's how you get power. That's how you climb and you serve and you please and you seek, and that's the way you'll get power for power's sake. Well, the problem is we have to oppose these governments because they're leftists. And we have to support the rightist governments because the rightist governments are friendly to us and the leftist governments are not. And again, we have to ask, what is right and what is left? I mean, I've been on radio and TV shows, you know, and the announcer will slay me. He'll say, "That's a leftist government, isn't it?" Well, that's a leftist. And I'll say, what's left and what's right? I mean, what are these just two world cults and you kind of join one or the other because you like the sound of the names and they're just embattled? I mean, what does it mean to be left? To be left means that you are for changing the existing social structure. To be left means you are for fighting privilege, for fighting exploitation, and for making changes. To be right means that you are firmly on the side of that privilege and that exploitation. And those right-wing generals and governments have a very good community of interest with the U.S. government and U.S. multinational corporations. And that's why they're our friends and our allies. And those left governments are perfectly ready and able and willing to have normal political, diplomatic, and economic relations with the United States. There isn't a single one of them, with the possible exception of Albania, that isn't willing to have normal relations, whether it's with Grenada under the New Jewel movement, or Nicaragua, or small countries like Vietnam, or big ones like the Soviet Union, and all, for years and years and years, long before this new thaw, long before Gorbachev, they have wanted normal and peaceful diplomatic and economic relations. You go to Cuba and they will tell you how, what the cost it is, the U.S. embargo and the U.S. boycott on Cuba. They have to go 16,000 miles away and buy their school buses from Japan when they could be buying them 90 miles away from Florida, from the U.S. They get their medical supplies from Czechoslovakia and so forth. It's absolutely in their interest to have normal relations with the U.S. That's exactly it. They want to be friendly with us because it's in their interests. Well, when does a nation pursue something other than their interests? And now you're admitting that their interest is to be friendly with us, and what's wrong with that? Why is that sinister? So what you sometimes get in this anti-communist mentality is a non-falsifiable kind of mentality that sets in, you know? If they walk out, as the Russians did in the first Geneva conference, because the U.S. was putting nothing on the table, you say, you see, they're hostile, they don't really want to negotiate. If they negotiate and put everything on the table and try to outdo us in each day coming off, you call that a propaganda peace offensive, and they're really trying to just show us up and make us look bad and trying to manipulate public opinion in Europe and other places like that. If there aren't enough consumer goods and all that, this proves the thing isn't working. If there are consumer goods, they're just putting them out now to try to buy off the population in order that they can hang on to power. If the churches are empty in the Soviet Union, this proves that religion is oppressed. If the churches are full, and I remember I was in Moscow, walked into a church and they were praying up a storm. This proves that people are turning their backs on the atheist regime and finding faith by going to God and all that. So A or not A can become a negative proposition. Doesn't matter. If they're friendly with us, we have to watch out, because if we let our guard down, we might end up being friends with them. And if we are friends with them, then we are not properly appreciating the risk that they are. It said they're a risk to us because they are a threat to national security. And again, I just reiterate what I'm saying, that every single one of these left revolutionary socialist communist governments, whatever you want to call them, including Gaddafi's Libya, have been eager to have normal relations. Gaddafi reiterated what he has been saying for the last 7 or 8 years. I'm happy to sit and negotiate and develop friendly relations with the U.S. That friendliness is a problem, of course. What do you do with an enemy who you hate because he's developing a competing social order? And that's Gaddafi's problem. That's why the U.S. hates Gaddafi. That's why there's such a media hype against Gaddafi all those years. It's not that Gaddafi was a terrorist. He admits to bankrolling a few terrorist groups, but most of the terrorist groups came out of Syria and Libya and Iran. But Gaddafi's real sin was that in 1969, he led a colonel's rebellion in Libya, in a country that had a social structure that was very much like Saudi Arabia, a small group of people living filthy rich with more money than knew what to do with estates and horses and mansions and Monte Carlo, whatever else, and a mass of people living in abysmal poverty. And the colonel's rebellion came in and kicked those people out, wiped them out, and began to redistribute the wealth, and then nationalize the oil. So the oil that's now taken out of Libya, at least more than half, 75% of the earnings now go back into Libya and belong to the people, into the public treasure. Planted 40 million trees, Gaddafi did. Started schools in Libya so that the Libyans are the best educated people in the Arab world. And started all sorts of other kinds of health programs, housing programs, job programs, whatever else. So the per capita income in Libya, as far as equity of distribution, not counting the rich, very rich in Saudi Arabia, is the best in the Arab world, and probably one of the very best, certainly one of the best in the third world. That's Gaddafi's sin. That is, he was tampering with the wealth of the world that belongs to global international capitalism. He was taking some piece of that and using it in a different way. And that, I maintain, is the sin. You can do anything else you want. You can do pretty much anything else you want. But if you do that, if you begin to develop an alternative economic order, an alternative class order, if you begin to develop an order that tampers with and threatens the basic multinational corporate interests, that's when the U.S. will come down on you. You tell me a country where it was the other way around. You tell me what they did to capitalist Brazil. When the Brazilian generals moved in and overthrew Goulart and said to the U.S. multinational corporations, come on in, boys, here it is. No more trade unions. The trade union leaders are all dead or tortured or in jail. There's no more minimum wage, no more occupational safety you have to worry about, no environmental protection laws. You come on in, you make it free, no taxes for the next century for you guys. We'll even give you some subsidies and put up some of the equity. Here it is, come on in, take it. And if anybody gets out of order, we've got our police and our army all trained and equipped by you, thank you, and we'll keep them in line. So you take what you want, just make sure you give me and my friends a little something, and we'll work it out. That was the working order. That kind of country can do what it wants. No, the U.S. will never attack it or try to isolate it or oppose it, because it works within that system of capital penetration and capital accumulation. Now, it's very hard to tell the American people that we go into these little countries to make the world safe, or Chase Manhattan Bank and ITT and General Motors and General Electric and General Dynamics and all the other generals. So you say to them, we go in there because those countries are a threat to our national security. And it's very hard to convince them that a small, tiny little country like Grenada or Nicaragua or Vietnam is a threat to U.S. national security. But the image is conjured up, you see. So what you do is you say, well, Nicaragua is the puppets of the Cubans, and the Cubans are the puppets of the Russians. And this is all part of this global red tide, which, as President Ronald Reagan said, might soon be lapping at our shores, at our boundaries. So the image is, you see, of them closing in on us. We used to hear this argument during the Vietnam War, which was, we have to fight them. These lights are... I hate to take this off because it's got my Canadian flag pin on it, but the argument we used to hear during the Vietnam War was that we have to fight them now because you have to fight them in the jungles of Vietnam. If you don't fight them in the jungles of Vietnam, you will end up fighting them on the beaches of California. And the image was of these Vietnamese getting into the little PT boats coming across the Pacific and taking California, you know. And the Russians would come down through Nova Scotia and Canada, and the Angolans would land in South Carolina, take that. And Nicaragua, with its 30,000 militia, would cut a swath up through Guatemala, Mexico, through the American heartland, right up here into northern Ontario, Thunder Bay, and dance with your sister. And the Cubans would take Miami. The answer there, of course, is the Cubans have already taken Miami. Now, it gets very troublesome when your enemy insists upon being friendly and unilaterally begins to get more friendly, and you stay nasty and you snarl and you say, that's a subterfuge, and then he makes more concessions and you snarl a little more and say, well, that's a little step in the right direction, but he's got a long way to go. And he makes more concessions and you say, well, these concessions are right, but he'd have to change his whole social system. And he starts changing his whole social system. And you say, well, that's a small step in the right direction. But after a while, you see, the people begin to see this. And the Soviet policy of we will deprive the U.S. of its enemy, I think, is one which really puts the U.S. in a serious position. That peace is breaking out everywhere. The enemy is getting friendly, and the very rationale we had to justify our aggression and our penetration in the third world, to maintain this system of global fascism, because that's what it is, because people are always talking about being soft on communism. Well, let me tell you, the U.S. policy is to be soft on fascism. Not soft on it, but loving it, but being in bed with fascism in Guatemala, in Indonesia, in Zaire, on 3 different continents. How do you justify that now? You say this is for our national security, and the enemy is not acting like an enemy. How do you finally justify the fact that it is you? It is you who are being hostile. We have to do this to Cuba because they're hostile to us. And yet the Cubans for the last 30 years have been saying, can we have trade? Can we have normal diplomatic relations? How do you justify your unwillingness to do that? You say, well, they're not democratic enough. We only associate with democracies like Zaire, Indonesia, Paraguay, and such. It's the same problem right now which the Likud party is having with the PLO. For years they have justified their aggression against the Palestinians by saying that the Palestinians are sworn to drive us into the sea. We want to be friends with them. By the way, this is not all of Israel's position. I'm talking about the right-wing Likud party. We want to be friends with them, but they are hostile to us. And the PLO has now come out and said, we accept the existence of the state of Israel. We ask for a two-state solution. And the answer is, those are just words. And that was the Bush's answer and Reagan's answer for a long time. Those are just words they're saying. That's not just words. Words, when nations use words, that's more than just words. Those are forms of policy. Those are positions taken. When one nation calls for a total ban on nuclear testing and another nation refuses a ban on nuclear testing, those two nations are not merely engaged in an exchange of words. Those are very real policy positions. And when one nation or representative of a would-be nation says, I accept your existence, let's live in peace, and the other side says, I do not accept that overture, that's a reflection of very substantial interest, and that's a form of action. Words can be a form of action. And even then when they take actions, the U.S. again then begins to retreat into its words and say, well, that action is insufficient, well, we really don't know how sincere it is, etc., etc. What I'm arguing then is that the real goal of U.S. foreign policy is to keep the world safe for capital accumulation, to keep the world safe for investment and profit, to keep the land, labor, capital, technology of the world accessible, because the margins of profit are stupendous. It's not for any of the other reasons that are usually given, because the evidence and the data doesn't support that. And those countries which are friendly and accessible for capital penetration and accumulation will have friendly relations with the U.S., will be friendly to them. And those which try to resist in some way and try to build up their own economy for their own people will run into trouble. That's the particular rule. If that's not the reason, then you tell me of a socialist country, you tell me of an instance where the U.S. has given support to socialist forces. You tell me of an example where the U.S. has given support to national liberation forces, other than right-wing ethnic guerrillas who might be fighting a communist government or socialist government, something like that. Occasionally they'll be friendly toward a socialist country like China when China opens itself up to capital penetration. By the way, I don't mean to say that the U.S. simply intervenes to protect direct investments. It's not just a matter of we go in there because we got money in there. I mean it's a matter of protecting a whole kind of global system. Reagan was right when he said, we invaded Grenada, it wasn't a matter of nutmeg. The only product out of little Grenada is nutmeg. I mean, you can get nutmeg from Africa. Well, Grenada is a tiny country of 110,000 people. And the U.S. went in there and invaded and really took it over, you know, and I'm ashamed to say, but there was some element, not all, don't judge us Americans too harshly, but there was some element in my country that actually got off on that invasion to Grenada. So we went in there, kicked their ass, huh? Oh, wow! I said, yeah, oh, let's go out and beat up a 3-year-old now, really feel good, you know? I mean, that was really something, wasn't it? Like the Toronto Maple Leafs versus Our Lady's Queen of Angels High School or something, and you, whoa, we really got them. Those body checks we threw on them really was something. Well, it wasn't nutmeg, but what it was, the invasion of Grenada was a way of serving notice to all the other nations of the Caribbean that if they tried this, if they tried developing a social revolutionary order, another kind of system, if they start trying to do things that so threaten North American security, like bringing Cuban doctors into their country, I mean, that really is a rotten, dangerous thing, isn't it? If they start doing things like that, like those literacy programs and these health programs and taking over land and redistributing land and starting these public job programs, not-for-profit programs, if they start doing that stuff, this is a message to them that this is what they're going to get. They're going to get the 82nd Airborne Division and down on their necks. And that's what that was. Now, we have a name for that. We call that imperialism. I call it imperialism because that's what it's always been. The U.S. media never calls it that. They call it security. They call it protecting our shipping lanes. They start making up all these fanciful choke points. Grenada was right there at a choke point. It was the linchpin on our whole anchor. If we lose Grenada, I mean, there goes Paris or whatever, and so forth. What they were saying, they were serving notice that a competing social order cannot be tolerated. In fact, several of the most dramatic U.S. interventions, in several cases, there wasn't that much U.S. capital directly involved. The invasion of Soviet Russia in 1919-1921 by 14 capitalist nations, including Canada, the Royal Mounted Police, I think they've got it up on a plaque somewhere that they were fought in wherever it was, Sebastopol or Murmansk, was it? I don't know where the Canadians were. They probably were the eastern part of Canada, eastern part of Russia. I'm sorry, the western part of Russia, Murmansk and Archangel. There was very little American. Most of that capital was British and some French. Vietnam is another case. Indochina. Almost all that capital, original capital investment, was French with some British. But the U.S. went in because the U.S.'s role today is to be the policeman of global capitalism. It is their responsibility. They have replaced the British, except for a few regional areas, They have replaced the British and the French in that job of making the world safe for hypocrisy, making the world safe for capital accumulation, making the world safe for investment, making the world safe for cheap labor markets, making the world safe for no tax, no protection markets. A link to that, I believe, is the nuclear arms race itself. The buildup of nuclear arms and the buildup of a global empire, and it is one of the most incredible empires in history in terms of its sheer scope. We may not own the countries, we just own the resources in the countries and control the markets and all that sort of thing. The old imperialism has been replaced by a neo-imperialism. You cannot see the American empire on a globe. When we were kids, we used to look at a globe and you could see all this pink, and it was the British Empire. We used to call that the empire upon which the sun never sets. And you can't see the American empire because now the process is neo-colonialism. Now you go in there and you let the country have its own nominal independence, and you simply control its investments, its finance, its land, its resources, and all that. And you go in for that. We're all over the world, and we have all these global, these 300-400 bases around the world, and we have these nuclear weapons because we are protecting that empire, and we're protecting it from the threats of competing social orders. The first one, and the biggest threat, always has been the Soviet Union. And that has always been on the mind since the day it came into existence, since the first invasions of the Soviet Union, which was to strangle Soviet Russia in its cradle in its first years, an expeditionary force that failed, a civil war that was supported and financed, white mercenary armies, just like the Contras today in Nicaragua. Again, that failed. And then diplomatic and economic isolation for years, and then trying to sig the Nazis onto the Russians, which, by the way, succeeded. I'm one of those people who never believed, I don't say never, but who no longer believe that Chamberlain was an appeaser at Munich. I do not believe that Chamberlain tried to appease Hitler. I know what appeasement is, and that isn't what he was doing. Chamberlain actively collaborated with Hitler. He actively was an ally. And at Munich, when they gave away Czechoslovakia and the Czechs said, no, we're going to fight anyway, Chamberlain came in and said, you try it, we'll cut off supplies to you. They took the money, Czech money in English banks and gave it to Hitler when he took over in Czechoslovakia. They actively collaborated with Hitler because Chamberlain and his ilk saw Hitler as a bulwark. Nazism was a bulwark against socialism arising in Germany. And a Nazi Germany was a bulwark against the spread of socialism throughout Europe. And the plan, and those people at Munich, and it's always called Munich, it's never called the Chamberlain-Hitler Pact. You have the Hitler-Stalin Pact. While Stalin was going strenuously trying to get the U.S. and France and Great Britain into an alliance against Hitler and against the Germans, Chamberlain was actively working the other way. And Litvinov, the Soviet ambassador, was going all over trying to get some kind of alliance and was rebuffed. And it was then in the summer of 1939 where Stalin turned the tables, realizing he was being set up, and signed his non-aggression pact with Hitler, which so infuriated the West. That kind of situation of taking as your primary enemy the socialists, the communists, and willingly collaborating with the Nazis, with the fascists, is exactly what is still going on today. You can be a fascist if you want. You can throw people in jail. You can beat them up. You can close their newspapers. As long as you leave that country open to capital penetration, as long as you're friendly to capitalism, as long as you're a Pinochet and not an Allende. So those nuclear arms are targeting a socialist country. At least it's still socialist. Who knows what the changes are in the future. It may move toward much more of a social democracy, as some of the other communist countries have already done. But those nuclear arms are targeting, and the Soviet Union to this day, 70 years after that revolution, is still the most targeted of all the socialist countries. Not Nicaragua, not Vietnam, but the Soviet Union still is. And there's an interesting correspondence between Secretary of State and President Woodrow Wilson back in 1919, where Secretary of State Lansing says, this Bolshevik revolution, the Russian Revolution, is a very dangerous example to the common person in our own country, the common man in our own country, is what he said. These Bolsheviks are talking about equality of property. This is the kind of idea that we cannot allow to spread around the world. I mean, they very explicitly said these things. This is explicitly was what on their minds. So these nuclear arms and this military supremacy are a way of, in fact, trying to this day, develop a first strike capacity that could so keep the Soviets under the gun that we could dictate terms in other local areas. The day, you see, the day of the Spanish Civil War is gone, back when Soviet merchant ships were sunk in the Mediterranean as they were trying to bring aid to the Spanish Republic, or Soviet goods were stopped at the French border and such. Today the Soviets can bring aid to Nicaragua or other places. Today the hope is that we could have such a nuclear supremacy, so keep the world under the gun, that we can dictate terms. We would be not one of two superpowers, but the only superpower. I maintain that is still Bush's goal. That while he's talking détente, he is still building first strike weapons. The stealth bomber, the MX missile, the midget man, the Star Wars, which both Bush and Vice President Quayle both are now hinting doesn't work. And if Vice President Quayle says it doesn't work, I'm beginning to suspect that maybe it does work. I don't know. But it's always good for a joke. I guess you know about him up here, don't you? His reputation has come this far, has it? See, so it's not true to say that nuclear arms can never be used. In a way, they're being used all the time. They are being brandished. They're part of your muscle, and therefore they're part of your policy, and they're part of your coercive power. So what's the use of having these weapons if you can't threaten other people with them? And what's the use of threatening other people with these weapons if they don't believe the threat is real? And how can they best believe the threat is real? By making sure you have such a supremacy, such a striking power, such a deterrence against any retaliatory force that in fact no one would dare hit back or could hit back. And the U.S. has used those weapons and threatened Vietnam, Korea, the Soviet Union itself, Iran indirectly. And you can name any number of other places and situations where the threat of nuclear weapons was used again and again. It's an instrument of policy. In addition, those weapons and that military establishment, which we're trying to address and confront in this disarmament week right now, that military establishment is a very profitable one. It's developed a structured interest of its own. It's not only, the military establishment of the U.S. not only defends the capital accumulation process of the world, it's part of that capital accumulation process, a very highly profitable part. First, it represents a whole new investment market that doesn't compete with your civilian market. So you keep accumulating profits and whatever else, and you build refrigerators, and you make more refrigerators and more refrigerators. After a while, your profit per unit is going to go down as your market gluts. Well, the interesting thing about a military market is that it never gluts. It has a built-in obsolescence. It's potentially infinite. I mean, what is enough guns? What is enough to guarantee security or defense? It's an infinite concept. You can just keep building and building and building. Someone's always going to come up with a new idea of a new weapon. A weapon can do this, a weapon that can evade radar, a weapon that will be able to this, that, so. And you can spend billions and billions and billions more. The second thing, it has a built-in obsolescence. You no sooner build one generation of weapons, then within a few years you have another new honing device, and you can build weapons that are superior to that, and those become obsolete, and so there comes a whole new area of capital investment and capital spending and profits. It has built-in guaranteed cost overruns, so that cost overruns of up to 800%. The C-58 bomber, C-58 transport plane was contracted for $1 billion. It ended up costing over $3 billion. It was a $2 billion cost overrun, 200%. The stealth bomber, the B-1 bomber that's being built now, those were supposed to cost $40 million each. They now are costing $500 million each. What is that? That's about 1,000% cost overrun. It doesn't matter. The Pentagon just says, Here you are. Yeah, how much? Oh, 5 billion? Oh, here. Oh, 20 billion here. That's fine. Because the people, by the way, ushering those weapon systems through is some lieutenant colonel whose career depends on that successful weapon system. That gets him his promotion. That'll get him his corporate executive job when he gets out of the Army. So there isn't really much of a check. It's non-competitive bidding. That means something like 99 or 98% of all the contracts, the amount you state is the amount you're going to be given. There's no competition against it. It's a heavily subsidized industry. Much of the equity in research and development is put up by the Pentagon itself. So when McDonald's says that they made only $10 million on a $100 million equity, what they don't tell you is that something like $70 million of that equity was put up by the Department of Defense itself. So they really made more like 33% profit, not 10% profit. Because they're making $10 million on their $30 million in a year in a particular factory, whatever else. Military contracts are like almost any other contract business can get. It's not like human services. It's not like those things which are used in the private sector that are built for not-for-profit, which actually infringe upon the public sector. A military contract is not only like something in the private, but it's even better than that. You have a contracted market. Person who builds refrigerators or cars or something then has to worry about selling them. But you've already sold the thing before you built it. The Army, the Pentagon has already said they'll take it. This explains something, you see. It wipes out the mystery as to why that military budget is so big and does nothing but keeps growing. Whether there's a Vietnam War or not a Vietnam War, whether there's Cold War or détente, that budget seems to keep going in only one direction, and that's upward, because there are powerful vested interests that accumulate enormous profits. And the rate of profit, given all the conditions I've just mentioned to you, that rate of profit is stupendous. It's huge. And it's not wasteful. It's not wasteful that the Air Force would build an F-16 fighter bomber, and then the Army will build almost a duplicate F-16 fighter bomber. That's not wasteful. That's wasteful for the taxpayer. That's wasteful for the ecology. That's wasteful from a human point of view. But this has nothing to do with human needs. If you're a defense contractor, that's not wasteful. That's wonderful. That's twice the amount of profits, twice the amount you can get and rip off. So that's the kind of dynamic we're facing here. And what we need, ladies and gentlemen, and that's the kind of dynamic, by the way, I think you're facing in Canada too, when people are talking about Canada's defense capacity is greater than its need or demand, and therefore let's integrate it in with the American market more, and let's get in on building more guns and all that sort of thing. All it can do is lead to yet further distortions in an already distorted economy. What we need, I think, in North America, all over, we need perestroika. We need a restructuring of our economy also. I mean, we need a very real and very genuine restructuring of that economy so that its wealth and its technology and its capital is used for the human needs of the society rather than for the rapacious greeds of a few multinational corporations. We need glasnost also. We need an opening for dissenting ideas. We need access to the national media so that these kinds of analyses can reach millions of people rather than small groups of people, so that the people who believe this way and see this way can make their case before the North American publics and not have to be struggling only by selling the sweatshirts and all that. I mean, we're struggling. It's a struggle to just keep this thing alive and keep it going. We need to awaken our people. People have to begin to really understand and feel and sense the power that they may have. And that power can be maximized. Often I always get people come up and say, what can I do as an individual? And the answer is, as an individual, maybe very little. As an individual, you can't do much. But if we organize and get together and work with others, then as a group you can begin to have an input and an impact, and you can cause a ferment. And that ferment percolates up. And believe me, the people up there see it. There isn't a leader in the world who's standing on the pyramid who doesn't know that the apex of that pyramid is supported by the base. And they're always looking down at that base. They're always worrying about what the people are thinking in modern mass society, either to keep them down, to threaten to terrorize them, or propagandize them, or whatever else. But they always worry about what the people are thinking, what the people are doing. So to say, do the people have power, is a little bit like asking, does Saudi Arabia have oil? I mean, the people are the very stuff of power. They're the raw material of power. The trouble is that others have been extracting it and refining it for their profit and advantage, and it's time for us to get back our own power resources. And you see what happens when people do that, when they begin to respond, when they begin to move. The nuclear freeze movement that went all through North America, all through Western Europe, all through much of the world, at least the Northern Hemisphere, for the nuclear freeze, that turned Ronald Reagan around. That's what caused him to go to the negotiating table. Ronald Reagan came into office in 1980 and he said, I will not negotiate with the Russians. They're an evil empire. You can't trust them. You sit at the table with them, you will come away tainted or something taken from you. They will deceive you. They will undermine you, whatever else. And within 2 or 3 years, he had to negotiate. And Reagan, too, was then saying, I'll negotiate, but it's going to take a long time. And by Reagan 3, he had gotten so caught up in the process and the pressure and the momentum of it, he actually had to sign a treaty, an INF treaty, which also gave him a good deal on it. But Gorbachev signed that treaty because it had 2 things in it. One, it got rid of the first strike MX and cruise missiles in Western Europe, and 2, no, not the MX, the cruise and Pershing missiles in Western Europe, and 2, it established the political reality that the 2 sides could sit and have this negotiation, have on-site inspections. It broke that mythology of the evil Russians who are there just snarling at us with enemies. And when Mikhail Gorbachev was in New York addressing the UN just the early part of this year, and his limousine drove down, I'm sorry, it was last year, year and a half ago, when he gave that speech in New York and talked about world peace, and it's time to get rid of all these weapons, it's time to redefine the fundamental realities of our world politics. He drove down New York. People came around, gathered around his limousine in New York. I mean, New Yorkers, there's no more cynical, jaded crowd than New Yorkers. I know, I was born and raised in New York. I can tell you that for sure. And there they were around his limousine like a bunch of happy children shouting, Gorby, 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 you know? I mean, it was tremendous. And the very next day, Secretary of State Schultz gets up on the radio and he says, well, there's no reason to go ape over this. I mean, he made a few good proposals, but don't have to get carried away. Sure, because he knows when his limousine drives down, they don't get around and yell, Schultz, Schultz, Schultz. They know, and those leaders know, and they watch, and they get very concerned when their people are opposing them and saying these policies are rotten and no good. And I know before too long, we're going to hear it from our Canadian friends in the North. They're going to lead us, and they're going to say, we want a nuclear-free Canada. Not just a nuclear-free Thunder Bay, but a nuclear-free Canada. No weapons, no nuclear weapons here. Those weapons serve no use for us. It is not any way in your interest. It doesn't protect you. It just invites you as a target. And it would be time, and I know within the near future, I mean, I can just see the determined looks on the faces here, that that's going to happen, and that's going to make me real happy. Thank you very much.
McLean Hunter Cable 7 TV, your community channel.
Okay, let's make this a happy,
real
upbeat question.
Well, I don't know how happy it is, but now you're saying economics is largely the motive behind all this global conflict. And I was just curious to know all the large amounts of loans that the United States and other developed countries has given to the third world countries, and now they're saying that they can't afford to pay them back. How does this come into play, and what does this mean? And also the Japanese now are largely coming in investing in the United States, and a lot of Americans are getting alarmed about that. They just bought into the motion picture industry and large department stores and a lot of real estate. So those 2 questions, I'm wondering, how do they come into play? And with the Japanese coming into investing in the States, how is that going to affect the United States' control?
Well, it means they'll never have to bomb Pearl Harbor again because they own it. They do own it. If you go to Hawaii, by the way, you go to Hawaii, I was in Honolulu, and along the shorefront are these magnificent homes that look out over oceans. I mean, the view is just utterly beautiful. And the odd thing is that I was noticing every third or fourth one had a for sale sign on it. So all these for sale signs all over here. It's an exodus of the rich, that they can find a better place than paradise to be living. And my friend said, well, no, as the Japanese came along and would knock on someone's door and say, would you like to sell this house? And kind of say, oh, this is paradise. This house, the market value of this house is $700,000 US, and even if you gave me 900,000 or $1 million, I wouldn't sell it because I'm just happy here. It's beautiful. And the guy would say, how about $2 million? I got it in the car here in cash or something. I'm not right in the car, but how about $2 million cash right on the head? He said, woo! And so he'd sell his house. And so now all these people have got their signs up there because the Japanese have so many American dollars. You see, they can't repatriate the dollars because we're not earning enough. I mean, they want yen, they don't want dollars. But they can't repatriate it because we're not selling enough to Japan in exchange. So there aren't enough dollars, you know, we're not making enough yen to convert for the dollars. So they just reinvest and keep the dollars on stateside. That's what's happening. With the loans, I guess you're having it has a terrible distorting effect on the economies of third world nations, as I know some of you know. It means exporting more and consuming less. What happens when a loan gets too big is the IMF comes in and calls for what they call it a stabilization program. Stabilization is a euphemism which means that what you do is you now cut your subsidies in housing or for bread prices or schools, whatever else. You spend less, you consume less, you force your workers to work harder for less money so that they will consume less, and yet you will make more and you can produce more to sell and export, and then that'll help you pay off your debt. Brazil had this campaign, export or die. We must keep exporting, exporting. Now the trouble is that they all keep exporting to the same Western market. The prices on their commodities are lowered anyway, and they're caught in the treadmill. The debt has gotten so high that it literally, by the seventh year, it literally doesn't do anything. I mean, you get almost no capital from it. It's almost, you're turning it over just to pay the interest, the enormous interest on it. And it's reaching a point where these countries may eventually default. I don't believe that'll bring down all the structure of Western finance capitalism, but it will be a real blow. You know what they say, that when you owe a bank $50,000, you're in trouble. If you owe the bank $50 million, the bank is in trouble. And this is and so this is a kind of a unresolved problem. But what we have to keep doing is speaking out, struggling, educating ourselves, educating others, organizing and agitating. Make the people up there as uncomfortable as possible and let them realize that they got it all wrong. We're not here to serve them, they're here to serve us. Okay, thank you very much.